to him through coughs and through a weakness, obviously, which he had, that he was not going to be able to deliver the closing address. So I want to begin by apologizing on his behalf for not being here for health reasons. We discussed for a moment, again through coughs, as to what we should do. And it's suggested to him that Professor Brian Meeks, if he had a speech, would be able to read that speech. He agreed, and I asked Professor Meeks if he would do us the honor of reading that speech. So I want to publicly thank Brian for immediately stepping up to the plate to read the speech that Honorable Patterson had prepared, but which he's unable to deliver in person because of health. So I wanted the entire audience to know that, because some of you were here, I think, just for that speech and to see him. The speech is here, but regretfully, he can't be because of health. So, thanks, Professor Meeks, and Dr. Lisa Vassiano will introduce Brian. Thank you.
And we wish Mr. Patterson a speedy recovery. PVC, Ms. Sandra Maynard. Member of Parliament, Mr. Philip Paulwell. Opposition Senator, Professor Floyd Morris. The Right Honorable Jeremy Corbyn and Ms. Laura Alvarez. Members of the Manley family. Conference Chair, Prof. Tony Bogues, Dean, Dr. Heather Ricketts, colleagues and friends, good evening. We have had 3 days of thought-provoking presentations, roundtables, and reflections. And now it is time for us to bring this event to a close. I have the pleasure of inviting Professor Brian Meeks, who is Professor of Africana Studies at Brown University, former Director of SELICES, former Head of the Department of Government here at UWI-Mona, my former lecturer of political philosophy. And whenever I teach international relations theories, I can hear him in my head speaking about Bentham and Locke and Mill and Hobbes and the state of nature and how these relate to theories of realism and liberalism and other things in international relations. I take pleasure in inviting you, Professor Meeks, to bring the closing remarks for this conference. Please welcome him.
Thanks, Lisa. And I'm going to take it that all who have been welcomed are equally welcomed by me. I've never done this before. I was also at one time public orator, but all of my speeches as orator were written by me, and certainly not by former Prime Minister Patterson. So the only caveat is that whenever you hear I's or turns of phrases, remember these are all P.J. Patterson's and don't belong to me. The name of his closing address is entitled Michael Manley's Legacy, A New Global Paradigm. Let me begin by commending the university and the co-sponsors for embarking on this series of conferences, which reflect on the lives and contribution of our past prime ministers to the evolution of the Caribbean region. This is a fitting start, as Michael Manley was in many spheres of his illustrious life, a trailblazer and a game changer. This connoisseur of cricket would be delighted to celebrate his century with a deserving recognition and laudable acclamation with the previous penetrating analyses and illuminating discussions have events from scholars and eloquent presenters involved in various facets of his life. The brilliant shots played all around the wicket are already on the scoreboard, and there's little left for a tailender like me. In his last letter to me of December 15, 1992, he wrote, quote, "It's been a long journey of our safari in 1969, unquote. That impelled me to use this closing presentation for sharing some reflections on our journey and his singular response to the global encounter that Michael envisaged in 1970. What would be his strategic approach to the world as it exists today? In cricketing imagery, how to pick and play the googly on a turning wicket." Quote, "I speak without apology as an unabashed internationalist," unquote. He declared at the outset of his political leadership. Quote, "Jamaica is not one little dot that is hanging in the universe by itself. What happens in the world has a fundamental effect on what happens in Jamaica," he elaborated. Jamaica's first prime minister, the Right Excellent Alexander Bustamante, saw the world as divided between East and West. For Michael Manley, the division that had the most profound bearing on Jamaica was that between, quote, "a metropolitan and developed region and a relatively underdeveloped, largely tropical region," unquote. He realized that Jamaica by itself had the power to do or change nothing, but, quote, "together with 107 nations and more than 2 million people, has the capacity to do it little by little," he proclaimed. Michael Manley's fiery rhetoric and fierce combat against imperial conquest was grounded in his strong ideological commitment to freedom and sovereign equality, as was his indignation at poverty and injustice of any sort or place. The passion and instinct of a supreme trade unionist perceived the primacy of an identity of interest common to the Caribbean, Africa, Central America, India, and Southeast Asia. The visit we undertook to Ghana, Zambia, Tanzania, Kenya, and Ethiopia was an essential trigger for the dialogue to begin as we prepare to assume the reins of national and eventually global leadership. Michael envisaged a future where global political and international processes would promote peace and development in a world of ideological pluralism. Jamaica's fourth prime minister fully understood that the mission of his generation, the post-colonial economic restructuring and social upliftment of Jamaica, could not be divorced from the post-imperial restructuring of global economic relations. That necessarily entailed the formulation of a broad alliance and a common strategy of the South to reform the iniquitous structures of international economic relations. This was a core pillar of Michael Manley's worldview and central to his concept of the national and regional mission. It is a fitting coincidence that the 100th anniversary of the birth of Michael Manley is also the 50th anniversary of the adoption by the United Nations of the Declaration on the Establishment of a New International Economic Order, NIEO. Other celebrated leaders from the global south were involved in the accompanying program of action for its implementation, but none more indelibly than Michael Manley. We can see today the validity of this worldview even more clearly than was the case 50 years ago. A new international economic order remained aspirational as the iniquitous structures and unequal relations of the past have yet to change. War and conflict heighten geopolitical tensions, which imperil access to food and energy. Health pandemics yield vaccine nationalism. Revolutions in technology threaten to leave us even further behind. Manley's unwavering commitment and dedicated work on behalf of the Global South sprang from his observation that for millennia, the combination of capital, technology, and exploitation of human and natural resources had resulted in wars, depressions, and recessionary periods. While the global economy had expanded considerably, the growing economic disparity between developed and developing countries had widened. Indeed, this was a phenomenon that engaged some of the brightest minds from the Global South, amongst them Arthur Lewis, Raoul Prebisch, and Alistair McIntyre. This phenomenon triggered as well the development of alternative and non-traditional economic theories. Our Mona campus of a bygone era was rightly engaged in the dialectics of the dependency theory versus the plantation theory. In all the discourse, the harsh reality was that 2/3 of humanity remained below the poverty line. The harsh facts persist that many of the countries continue to grow more slowly. At the same time, the growth rate in economically advanced market economies was accelerating. This was a global context that incubated the vision of a new international economic order. It was a period in many respects, in many aspects, remarkably reminiscent of today, a time of cascading and multiple crises. Indeed, the decade was characterized by the collapse of the gold exchange monetary system, currency instability, an upsurge in global inflation, widespread harvest failures, and the quadrupling of oil prices for many developing countries. The Algiers Summit was the incubator for the United Nations' 6th special session in 1974, which adopted the declaration of the establishment of a new international order and its related program of action. How can we forget the historic flight of Fidel and Michael to the 4th Summit of Non-Aligned Countries held in Algiers in 1973, a year after Michael first came to office? At the insistence of the G77, our agenda in 1975 focused on 6 major areas: international trade, transfer of rail resources and international monetary reform, science and technology, industrialization, food and agriculture, and the restructuring of the economic and social sectors of the United Nations system. So high was our standing on the global stage that Jamaica was one of the group of 19 countries selected to represent in Paris the interests of the Third World in negotiations for a restructuring of the world economic order and a new regime for global development. With Jamaica in the cockpit, the Global South sought the structural transformation of an international economy whose main institutional features had been determined and established without our involvement and which functioned to our detriment. When that final push was made to address major issues in the fields of raw materials, energy, trade, development, and money and finance in an integrated manner, the North resisted any change that would dilute their historical power and influence, which might lead to outcomes less advantageous to them. That great black American, Frederick Douglass, said it more than a century and a half ago, quote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, it never will," unquote. Michael Manley always understood this. I trust in our pursuit of a new world order shaped by the quest for harmony, equity, and justice, rather than entrenching the spoils of empire and victory in the Second World War. Leaders, regardless of their political stripe, will learn this rather than attempt to belittle or distort his legacy of vision and purpose. Truth be told, by that time, both the political and economic headwinds were in the realm of Category 5. During the decade of the 80s, governments virulently hostile to the idea of a new international economic order had come to the fore in major industrialized countries. Moreover, the debt crisis that was to bequeath a lost decade in much of the developing world was in full train. Consequently, the number of IMF-led programs more than doubled in the 1980s, and at its peak, more than 40% of developing members, including Jamaica, were submerged. Rather than the elixir of a new international order, the bitter gall of the Washington Consensus and of structural adjustment was to be the fate of the global South. By the time Michael Manley resumed the reins of government, the tectonic plates had shifted. The Soviet Union had been dismantled, Germany had been reunited, the rubric of apartheid and colonialism in southern Africa was crumbling. The sole superpower was extending its hegemony, and capitalism was spreading in an uneven global marketplace. Since then, we've witnessed the emergence of a powerful China, militarily and economically. As the non-aligned movement has declined, a new axis is emerging, forged on alliances with differing political systems and growing economic clout. The current steady swing to the right in a number of G20 countries will place further challenges in the global South. Even before taking office, Trump has threatened a tariff war to punish those nations who seek to create a new currency for trade and thereby terminate the might and budgetary laxity of the United States that stems from the US dollar as the only currency. We're all too familiar with the patterns of destabilizing governments and their economies, which are not subservient to their orders. We can anticipate an increase in pressure against doing business with China. Will we have the courage to resist? Let us be reminded of Michael's constant plea, quote, "All we ask for is to be left alone and create our own path," unquote. As this symposium draws to a close, I suggest that our leaders look to the future of our planet with the benefit of the lessons to be learned from the accumulated experience and insights of Michael Manley during the varied phases of his extensive international engagement. If we have learned anything, it should be that history and with it human development does not proceed in a straight line. Each epoch of struggle, each period of contestation, whether in the realm of ideas, of politics, culture, or otherwise, lays the ground for the next. It is not far-fetched to conclude that this is precisely what we're witnessing in the global arena. It would be wrong and defeatist to view the setbacks encountered as failures. They are battles in a war which must be fought until the final bell and victory is won. In the years that have passed since Michael Manley's exemplary leadership in the pursuit of a new international economic order, the fundamental challenges have really not changed. It was Heraclitus who wrote, quote, "The only constant in life is change," unquote. In the passage of time, several of those changes have made things worse. The current environment is characterized by multiple and cascading crises, by wars and conflicts in both the developed and the developing world, by currency instability and global inflationary pressures, by a burgeoning debt crisis in the global south, by a global pandemic, and by food and energy insecurity. Today, there's a major complicating factor. We have the phenomenon of a growing populist international revolt. Migration and border security have emerged as major issues in electoral campaigns of several developed countries as autocratic forces replace liberal democracies. We must be on the alert to avert becoming embroiled in fights against countries with which we have shared productive partnerships on the command of nations which have their own adversarial axe to grind. Only 15% of the Sustainable Development Goals are on track, and more than 3 billion people live in countries that are spending more on servicing debt than they spend on health and education. Half the world has been left behind. The dangers of global warming threaten our very existence. We have been the victims and should exact the full price from those who caused it. Today, the emasculation of the United Nations as a forum for global governance, the impotence of the Security Council to bring peace and security, whether in Ukraine or Gaza, the exclusion of an entire continent, Africa, as a permanent member, render the compelling cry for institutional reform of an obsolete system of global governance impatient of debate. Our repeated calls for drastic reform of the Bretton Woods institutions have gone unheeded. Hence the emergence of new development banks in the South, including the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, the Development Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean, Afrexim Bank, and the Development Bank for Resilient Prosperity, launched at the university's regional headquarters a fortnight ago. A serious exploration of the feasibility of using our natural resources as equity investment in global initiatives rather than usage as a single generation null-traded commodities is gradually gaining expert examination. Take a pause. While the second decade of the new millennium is in so many ways the same divided world Michael Manley deplored, there have been a few initiatives which bring glimmers of hope. More and more, as he envisioned, the economic South has come to recognize that our salvation lies in our own hands. Only we can remove the shackles of imperial exploitation which entrenched our poverty and hunger. In the 90s, trade amongst countries of the North was 60% of global trade. Today, it is only a quarter. Even more notably, trade amongst countries in the global South is now as high as 35%, making it the largest component of global trade. These developments indicate that there are noteworthy changes taking place in the structure of the global economy. This makes it more important, not less so, that change should now also take place in universal institutional structures and governance. The past is indeed prologue. Sometimes old issues may lose their primacy, but the underlying asymmetry remains even as new ones arise, all of which are of considerable importance to small developing states. This is a seminal moment in global relations when Jamaica must once again exercise its sovereignty and agency to be in the vanguard with the expansion of BRICS and the 54 nations of Africa, to design our own model and modalities to create the development and prosperity that have so long eluded us in the existing global order. Michael Manley would not ignore BRICS, which constitute 30% of the world's land surface, 45% of the world's population, with a combined GDP of US 88 trillion. He would applaud this bold challenge to Western domination and the creation of an alternative currency to the American greenback, which has ruled the world since the abolition of the gold standard. Where does Jamaica stand? We must once again be a leading voice in the world community to treat fairly and responsibly with digital inclusion, vaccine equity, and sharing the carbon neutral burden, especially with regard to the availability and propagation of clean technologies for sustainable development. Africa is the continent of the future. By 2050, 1 in 4 of the global population will be African. I can hear Michael saying, PJ, that umbilical connection with the continent of Africa that inspired the start of our exciting journey in 1969 is a plank on which we must shape the future of global Africa to foster economic and cultural growth. Let us enhance African-Caribbean economic integration in order to build collective self-reliance and emerge as a global economic market power. We at the Institute for African-Caribbean Advocacy are pleased to have co-sponsored this symposium. We believe that the 70 sovereign states in Africa and the Caribbean Sea, which combine nearly 40% of UN membership, in an alliance with Latin America, have a commanding voice to ensure a total reform of the global architecture. Our agenda must prioritize greater value added in production and trade, enhance food, energy, and pharmaceutical resources, and advance our capital in artificial intelligence. The last section he calls finale. For far too long, poverty and inequality have prevailed on planet Earth. 50 years ago, the courageous thrust to reform the international monetary, financial, and trading systems under the rubric of the NIEO was stifled. Let us hearken the words of Michael Manley, quote, "Never to be bullied into silence, nor to be lured into passivity and acceptance again, but to sail forth proudly and fight for dignity around the world, unquote. So solidarity and consolidation is no longer merely an option. It is an imperative to fulfill our prospects of hope. Full time now, we need a new global paradigm. There can be no peace without justice. Peter Tosh. Michael Manley's legacy is a bequest that we work resolutely to build a lasting edifice, founded on the rocks of struggle and unity of purpose, to create enduring peace and justice for all mankind. He has thrown down the gauntlet. Forward ever, backward never. P.J. Patterson. And it wasn't hard to read.
Thank you very much, Professor Meeks, for so graciously agreeing to deliver that speech on behalf of P.J. Patterson. Distinguished guests all, one speech remains, and Dr. Heather Ricketts has already appropriately welcomed the chair of the conference committee, Professor Tony Bogues. So all that's left for me to do is invite him to the podium to greet you all. Please welcome him warmly.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vassiani. At 2 minutes past 6, I want to say thank you all for coming to this particular conference in honor of Michael Manley. Let me begin by thanking the team. Most persons who spoke about the organization of this conference talked about Professor Bogues and his team. But the team has names, and the teams have personalities. So let me just list them for you all. Lisa Vassiani, as an important member of the team. Samuel Brathwaite, who is an economist from Guyana. Dr. Maziki Thame, another member of the so-called team. Then there's Francisco Lloyd, who did our PR and works in marketing here. And then there's Marjorie Bryan, who held it together in many ways. There were other people who worked on the team, but who did not come regularly to our 9 o'clock Monday morning meetings. But I would just say to them, thank you for whenever they came and had ideas to give us in that morning and those mornings. Let me thank the Honorable Jeremy Corbyn and Laura Alvarez, who are our special guests. Jeremy Corbyn, as I said on Tuesday night introducing him, that when I asked him on the phone, I mean, there's a very circuitous way in which we got in touch with each other, but when we finally spoke on the phone, the only thing he said to me is, yes, I will come under the condition that you take me to Kingston College. And we were able to meet that condition, so I would like to thank the people from Fortis who made that possible. I also would like to thank all the speakers and presenters who gave up their time over the last 2 days to make this a rich conference. When we were talking to each other about the conference, we wanted to make sure that the people at the conference who presented panels belonged to another generation that did not have gray hair. And I think we were able to do that to some extent. And I therefore want to thank those younger people for stepping up to the plate and participating in this conference. The follow-up to this conference will be two things. And I would obviously like to thank the dean and the principal and the university hierarchy and the vice chancellor for supporting us. The follow-up to, and let me, before I forget, my own University Brown, who once I spoke to them in June about this, did not say to me why. They just said, okay, yeah, here you go again. And we argued about what a budget looked like, but they never made any kind of demands at all. Only that one gives a proper accounting of what it is you are going to spend, which you really need to do. So I want to thank Brown. The follow-ups to this conference are going to be two things. One is a publication of some of the best papers of the conference, and the editors for that volume would be Dr. Tame, Dr. Lisa Vassiani, and myself. We are already in discussions with a press about this publication. I'm thinking that it will probably be a publication that really talks about the 70s in many ways. And so that we will probably come to other people to ask them if they can write something. The second outcome of this is going to be what Jeremy Corbyn suggested. And that is to see how we can do video clips of some of the speeches and also of some of the presentations that can be put on YouTube about this conference. I want to thank Jeremy, Mr. Corbyn, for that suggestion. So those are the two outcomes that I know we'll be working on. What kind of conference did we have in mind? Part of the idea of commemorating this 100th anniversary of Michael Manley was about how not to position him. He's right. There will be a discussion for generations about how to position him. But it was really about how in the present moment, with the dominance of a certain kind of neoliberal thinking, with the closing of horizons of possibilities, with the feeling that nothing else is possible other than that what we have, because I just saw it set, was how to reactivate a certain kind of figure in Caribbean politics that may just open a space for us to begin to have another kind of discussion other than I just saw it set and you can't do nothing about it. And therefore, for us, this conference was a certain kind of intervention. Jeremy Corbyn picked it up very, very quickly. When he said to me, as we were walking across, coming to the Undercroft on Tuesday evening, he said, what you're trying to do is to change the narrative, aren't you? And I said, yes. What we're trying to do is to put another narrative in place, one that maybe over time can contest the dominant narrative about the impossibilities of change in Jamaica and in the world. That narrative, dominant narrative, has come to dominate Jamaica and elsewhere around the world. But the other thing I think that we wanted to think about in the conference was really how to begin a tradition and process in the Caribbean in which we can begin to critique, to discuss openly the work of some of our political leaders. And therefore, it wasn't just about, okay, how do you have the Labour Party present? It was also about how you would get people from the Labour Party who may have something to say, even in criticism of the 1970s and of Michael Manley himself. And so that therefore one of the political panels, which didn't quite work, Brian, because quite frankly, when you have two party leaders, sometimes these things don't, even if you give them instructions, they are accustomed to giving you instructions, not to take instructions. Then they do what they want to do. But I think even that panel was an important one to have both the Labour Party and former Prime Minister, and also then to have former President of the People's National Party in some kind of conversation. There are a couple of things I want to say before finally wrapping up. And they are these. We have spent a lot of time talking about the internal forces. Spent a lot of time talking about Jamaica. We perhaps have not spent a lot of time talking about the external forces. And I just want to say a few words about those external forces. In part, because in the middle of writing a book on the 1970s, I have been spending a lot of time in the American National Security Archives, and I've finally gotten permission for some documents. And in a particular document written in 1976, titled CIA Option for Jamaica, that's the name of the document, presented to the National Security Council, there's a 11-point argument about why Michael Manley needed to go. It is interesting because it also names people in this country who they were in conversation with, and about how those persons were feeling about Michael Manley. It is also interesting because when the document is presented, it creates a debate in the American National Security organized center, entity within the American government, between President Carter on one side, Andrew Young with him, former ambassador to the UN, and members of the United States National Security. About the document, this is what is other interesting points about it. The CIA wants to overthrow Manley, but is cautious about when they should do it, and are also trying to hold back internal forces in Jamaica who they say want to move too quickly. And then they say in the document and the minutes of the meeting that what they need to do is to perhaps just wait and see. Carter agrees with that because he's persuaded by Andrew Young. But something else happens in 76, 77. It is Michael's speech at the Non-Aligned Movement, but importantly, it is his advocacy for Puerto Rican independence. And what is clear is that in that advocacy for Puerto Rican independence, the people in the National Security Council revisit the document, take it back to President Carter with a couple of additions. Andrew Young no longer has a certain presence. He's arguing, but he's no longer paid attention to in those meetings. And they keep on saying, this is about Puerto Rican independence and about, therefore, us, our internal affairs. And they say to President Carter, what should we do? Carter writes on the document, let's do it. So when you're talking about Michael Manley and when you're talking about Jamaica, what you are talking about is a situation in which the most powerful imperial country in the world has made it clear that this country and its political leadership and the political party that was ruling the country should go. And you can then map at that point in time a certain kind of way in which violence began to occur. And I say that because Professor Meeks asked a question about violence yesterday. And it is absolutely clear that both political parties were involved in violence. It is absolutely clear that there's a certain kind of political tribalism. But what I think one needs to think through very carefully is, was there any qualitatively different kind of violence that occurred in this country between 1977 and 1980? And therefore, were we seeing just political tribalism, or were we seeing military actions that was about a certain kind of destabilization? The argument I'm making is that all the external evidence suggests that what Michael Manley, what the People's National Party represented, because it wasn't just Michael Manley, it's the People's National Party, what they represented was something that was anathema into American imperial power and had to go. And therefore, when we think about Jamaica in 1980, then it might be useful to think about how this country was engaged in civil war, yes, but that we were the progressive, let's call it progressive, the broad progressive movement was defeated militarily, was defeated ideologically, and was therefore defeated politically. And then we might want to think, since that moment, how have we coped with it? What has been the trauma that has been created in the country since that point in time? And how, in fact, we might want to confront that, not for consensus, but confront it as a way of historical truth-telling. Because it is historical truth-telling, I would want to put it on the table, that would allow us to work through it and to get to the other side that we need to actually get to. Other point I would want to make is something about the 1980s. And I haven't spoken because everybody else should speak. The party president and myself had many debates. We did not debate publicly. There was a kind of tacit agreement. But we did not agree on many things. And one of the things we debated about was the so-called pivot. And we debated it everywhere. In the car to a meeting, in his office at home. in Jamaica House, over lunch, at dinner. We were always arguing. And one day he said to me, Tony, the time is out of joint. Quoting Shakespeare, Hamlet. And I said to him, yeah, I think so, but tell me why. And he related a story which I am going to relate to you all because I think it's important for you all to know. When he was removed from office, there was a meeting set up in Cancun. Ronald Reagan was now in charge of the United States. So Michael couldn't go to that meeting because he was no longer prime minister. But he and a man called Julius Nyerere worked as a tag team on the new international economic order. And I know that. I saw them in meetings and so on, and planned strategy as to what to do and what not to do. And he and Julius agreed that, Julius would go and represent an NIU at the Cancun meeting. President Nyerere gets to that meeting. NIO is on the agenda. Ronald Reagan is in the chair. They get to that section of the agenda, and the President of the United States says, next item. There is not a murmur from even the allies, and they move on. It is at that moment, if you ask me, that Michael Manley felt to himself, the time is out of joint. Because not only was President Reagan in charge, but that the allies who he had worked with were now not even supporting what they had supported before that. And so that we can argue about the marketization and so on. And I think there's a lot to argue. But I think the understanding about the time being out of joint and what that meant and how, therefore, leading a country like Jamaica after what had happened in the 1970s led to a set of decisions. Those decisions, I would argue, as sicker as he got more ill, he began to reflect on. And before he passed, we had two sets of discussions. And I'm sorry Glenn Manley is not here. The first discussion was about the writing of his biography. And he began to write it, but couldn't finish it because he was ill. The second discussion was about how we would write a book about the democratic left. In other words, what was required in this new period about a certain kind of progressive politics. Not now just about markets and so on, but what is it that was now required for those of us who want to think about in the left way, what he called the democratic left? What was now required? The outline of that I have and will present to the University of the West Indies at the appropriate time, because it shows somebody, in my view, who is thinking and struggling with what the new situation is, but trying to make sure that he's on a certain kind of path that does not abandon where he began. This conference, therefore, I say these things because I think perhaps appropriately there's a moment when you have to say some of these things. And I say these things because I think it's important that those of us who want to see Jamaica be a different place need to understand some of the nuances of that history. Because history is a very funny thing. It is only those who are in power who tell it in a certain way. Those of us from the margins have a different set of stories to tell about what so-called history looks like. So I end where I began. The conference was about opening a space to begin to think through a certain kind of politics for the 21st century. A politics that, in my view, needs to be based on this word which I think is abused, has become abused, but which I think is still important, about transformation. What it is that a post-colony like Jamaica needs to do. What are the requirements for transformation? The transformation that would mean that for the ordinary person, ordinary man and woman in Jamaica, they can feel, in the words of a woman in St. Ann Bay, tell him in a meeting, Jamaica must be nice for everybody, not just for the few. Let me thank you all for coming. And before I close, let me do an advertisement for a book for one of our panelists. Mr. Neville Clark, has written a book called The Necktie Man, a very handsome photograph on the cover. And he asked me to advertise the book for those of you who want to read it, and that you can get it on Amazon.com. And it's called The Necktie Man. Let me thank you all very much again for coming and say not just that the word is love, but one heart and one love. Thank you all.